Die, monster! You don't belong in this world!
The Castlevania series is one of the more interesting of old school titles out there, in that it's almost kind of become a cult classic at this point. Not a huge amount of people I see tend to talk about it, even though Netflix have adapted it into a pretty awesome anime. Castlevania's influence can be felt strongly in gaming, even if you've never played a Castlevania game. You've more than likely played a game which has taken strong influence from it. I'm talking games like Blasphemous, Dead Cells, Dark Souls, particularly Bloodborne, and even Jedi Fallen Order bear strong similarities to certain games in the franchise. Now, I say certain games here because a lot of people when they think Castlevania think of arguably the best entry in the series, Symphony of the Night from the PlayStation 1. For good reason too. The series originally started as a 2D action platform game, as you navigated through a series of levels set in Dracula's castle, as a whip-wielding badass from the Belmont family of vampire hunters. Each game, besides Simon's Quest, would follow this formula pretty closely, offering up improved visuals and increasing difficulty. Oh yeah, these old games were hard. It was Symphony of the Night that really shook up the formula completely. Borrowing heavily from the Metroid series, which is where the term Metroidvania comes from, this game ditched the level-based approach and instead made the castle a huge open-ended world to explore with light RPG elements and puzzle solving, which largely revolved around backtracking to previous areas after finding a key item or unlocking a certain ability. Simon's Quest had attempted this approach too, but it wasn't very good due to its barbaric difficulty and really obtruse puzzles. Symphony would strongly shape the series' identity going forward, as the majority of the games that followed would stick to this Metroidvania approach, and the series proved to be a great success in this format.
We better go slash some candles and save up.
However, it was during the first few attempts to transition into 3D that the series didn't fare particularly well. The first attempt came in the form of Castlevania 64, which went back to the level-based approach of the first games. It looked decent visually and had some interesting puzzles based on its day and night system, but it was let down by sluggish controls, a shoddy camera, and, once again, high difficulty. Surprisingly, this game actually received an expansion pack of sorts in the form of Legacy of Darkness, which had 2 new characters, redesigned levels, and new enemies. The next 2 attempts were on PlayStation 2 with Lament of Innocence and Curse of Darkness, which were a bit closer to the Metroidvania design, and honestly, they weren't bad games. Both boasted gorgeous visuals and awesome music, but they suffered from kind of monotonous level design that took a long time to explore, and backtracking often felt like a chore. Curse of Darkness also probably didn't fare too well due to the release of God of War earlier that same year. I might end up covering Curse of Darkness in more detail in a future video, since I recently revisited it, and it's more interesting than I remember.
I'm interested in this.
It was with the 7th generation of consoles that Konami, noting the dwindling sales of the handheld titles, wanted to reinvent and introduce the franchise to a new and hopefully larger audience. After presenting a rather awesome pitch video, Konami outsourced this task to a Spanish development studio called Mercury Steam, who at that time had worked with American McGee on Scrapland and developed the mixed-received first-person shooter Clive Barker's Jericho. When it was finally revealed in 2009 with the debut trailer, a lot of hype quickly grew around the game. Not only did this new game look polished, but there was also some big names attached to it, like Robert Carlyle, Sir Patrick Stewart, and Jason Isaacs, who was obviously going to be playing Dracula, right? The big one that got people talking though was Hideo Kojima being involved, who, given his reputation, gave Lords of Shadow a certain confidence that it might actually turn out alright. So let's talk about it.
But enough talk! How about you?
Castlevania Lords of Shadow was a very different beast to any of the previous games that had come out before. It was a complete reboot of the established and admittedly mucky canon, which set out to create a brand new mythology about the Battle of the Belmonts and Dracula, though it did have a few nods to the older games, Lament of Innocence in particular for those paying attention. Lords of Shadow tells the story of the end days of the year 1047, where the Earth's connection to the heavens has been cut off by the Lords of Shadow, trapping the souls of the dead and allowing evil creatures to inhabit the land. Our protagonist here is Gabriel Belmont, voiced by Robert Carlyle, a warrior from the Brotherhood of Light who is on a quest to destroy the Lords of Shadow, in the hopes in doing so he'll be able to resurrect his recently dead wife Marie, using the 3 pieces of the God Mask they possess. According to the art book, Gabriel's design was one of the key areas where Hideo Kojima stepped in and suggested changes. Originally, Gabriel was meant to have a more feral, barbarian look, similar to Reinhard from Castlevania 64. Which didn't sit well with Hideo, and he said that his look should be changed to both make him appear more relatable and also reflect the tragedy of his character. It would also seem that this initial design would later be used for Simon Belmont in the sequel, Mirror of Fate. A few of the aforementioned nods to Lament of Innocence are part of Gabriel's character, notably his weapon the Combat Cross being made by one Ronaldo Gandolfi, and his in-game bio suggesting that he may be a bastard child of the Kronkvist family, but I'll get to that later. The story is essentially split up into 3 acts, with the Land of the Lycans, Cornell being a reference to Cornell from Castle 64, the Land of the Vampires, where the titular Castlevania is, and the Land of the Necromancers. And I'll say it right now that this is a damn long game, easily pushing past the 20-hour mark on a first playthrough, and it was one of the few games I'm aware of that came on 2 discs on the Xbox 360. There isn't too many cutscenes throughout the game. I'd say maybe 20 or 30% of the runtime is devoted to cutscenes, which are really well presented and acted by the voice cast. The show stealer here is undoubtedly Sir Patrick Stewart, and unlike Bethesda with Oblivion, Mercury Steam decided to properly utilize him.
And close shut the jaws of Oblivion.
You serious?
Sir Patrick's character Zobek narrates the game, and as each level loads, he tells the story, and it's a great time listening to him.
He will need more than physical prowess when he faces her. She can put a glamour upon his heart that will tempt him to forget everything he knows, even his beloved. She holds the next piece of the mask, and I fear that he will fall at the last.
Which I guess leads on to how it actually plays, and I'm going to address one of the biggest criticisms a lot of people made in their reviews, that the game didn't feel like a Castlevania game. I mean, 1, that was kind of the point of it being a reboot, and 2, the truth of that statement is that Lords of Shadow didn't feel like a Metroidvania game, which, as I pointed out earlier in the video, is only one style of Castlevania game. Lords of Shadow returns to the level-based progression of the early Castlevania games, broken up into 12 main chapters, each with their own number of levels, as well as 2 DLC chapters. The progression of the levels design-wise is very reminiscent of the Super Nintendo title, Super Castlevania 4, and to a lesser extent Curse of Darkness, where a large portion of the game is actually devoted to the journey to the castle, as opposed to most of the games being set entirely in the castle. You could even return to previous levels and acquire hidden upgrades once you've unlocked certain abilities from later stages. I also think it should go without saying that even in 2021, this is an absolutely stunning looking game. The art team at Mercury Steam did a phenomenal job creating the many vistas you see throughout the game, with so many varied locations that half the fun of progressing through the game is to just see the next environment you end up in. You explore everything from swamps, ruined cities and temples to snow-covered towns, with some of the real highlights being the exterior areas of the castle, which are just simply jaw-dropping at times. The music was also really good, with some fantastic orchestral tracks composed by Oscar Araujo. I actually liked the music from these games so much, I modded them into one of my Skyrim playthroughs, because I'm just that kind of guy. The score for Lords of Shadow was pretty different from previous games, which sounded like this. But there were still a few nods to the older games in a couple of the tracks. Lords of Shadow launched in 2010, which placed it pretty much right in the middle of the like God of War but era, with Darksiders, Dante's Inferno, and God of War 3 itself launching earlier that year. It was very much in the same vein of God of War in terms of its basic gameplay, that calling it a God of War clone isn't exactly an unfair assessment. Gabriel moves through the levels with a camera that follows you from fixed angles, he attacks with an extendable chain whip similar to Kratos' Blades of Chaos. You have your light attacks, which are quick hitting, and you have your heavy attacks, which are slower but offer increased damage or area of effect, hitting more enemies at once. Every enemy you kill gives you experience points, which you can spend on various combos. However, I actually think the combos you unlock in Lords of Shadow are a lot more unique and impressive than the ones in God of War. Like, check some of these out. The animation work is superb, and the beefy sound effects really give Gabriel's whip a feel like it's making a real impact and doing some serious damage. Returning from the previous games, Gabriel can use sub-weapons in combat too. The first and most basic is the daggers, which are most effective against the lichens. Then you have these butterflies that are supposed to stun enemies, but they're honestly the most ineffective sub-weapon, and I only used them once in the whole game to beat a trial. The next is these explosive potions that deal splash damage and are best to use against the vampires. And lastly is basically the BFG of the game, a summon that requires 4 crystal shards before it can be used that kills everything in the area, which, you know, is pretty awesome.
Would you do that?
A magic system is also introduced fairly early into the game, broken up into light and dark magic. Both of these power up Gabriel and provide additional benefits to his attacks. With light magic, every hit recovers health, whereas with dark magic, every hit does additional damage. The magic gauges are filled by orbs, dropped by enemies after your focus meter is filled, which is done by maintaining a consistent attack streak without taking damage. These systems add an interesting depth to the combat loop, encouraging the player to learn enemy attacks in order to effectively dodge to maintain the focus meter, especially since the light magic will be the one used most often, as the fountains that restore your health are often few and very far between in most levels. Additional combos can also be unlocked that utilize the 2 different magic types, that further encourages learning how to maintain the focus meter, and also hunting down the many hidden gems throughout levels that upgrade the capacity for your magic, as well as your overall health too. The other half of the game outside of the combat is broken up into light puzzle solving, whether that be these glyph puzzles utilizing both magic and certain abilities, or key fetching for a locked door. Traversal plays a big part of this too, with most levels featuring elements of platform jumping and climbing up various cliffs and walls, similar to the Prince of Persia games or Tomb Raider. The platforming gets progressively more difficult as the game goes on and more abilities are required. You'll be performing sprinting double jumps across chasms and using the grapple hook on your whip to repel or swing to new areas, very similar to how the whip could be used in Castlevania 4. Putting all of these mechanics together the way they have been here actually makes Lords of Shadow almost like a hybrid of what the previous 3D Castlevania games had attempted, but actually successfully. Castlevania 64 was very much a platforming focused game, but suffered from slippery controls and a woeful camera, while the PS2 entries were much more focused on combat with almost no real platforming, yet suffered from repetitive level design and lacking in depth to the combat. Lords of Shadow does both of these things really well, which just makes for a more enjoyable experience.
What does this mean? Tell me.
That's not to say it's all perfect, however, and there are a few issues the game does have. The fixed camera angles, while often cinematic and artistic to look at, can sometimes get in the way of the moment-to-moment gameplay, which might be fine in something slow-paced like Resident Evil, but in a fast-paced game like this, there are moments where this can become a hindrance. Sometimes enemies will be outside of your field of view, making them hard to attack or avoiding incoming attacks, which means losing your focus meter. Other times the camera just won't make it obvious enough where you're meant to jump, resulting in a few leaps of faith or hanging on a ledge like a doofus. Some puzzles even require you to punch certain objects, often in a timed manner, and the camera can do a real number on trying to position yourself in the right spot to pull these off, which can be frustrating, particularly in this fight against a mech scorpion, as failing the timing results in it regaining all of its health. I should say that these are rare moments, and most of the time the camera angles are well placed, but I also can't help but feel that a free camera would have improved some areas, and it would have been nice too to be able to properly look at some of the vistas the game has. One of the most outright annoying puzzles involves this creature called a Chupacabra that will steal all of your relics and force you into an annoying game of hide and seek as you try to find it somewhere in the level. These sections just really aren't fun and feel like padding on what is already a really long game, and this happens 4 times. The last time it happens is really close to the end of the game, and by that stage you're already feeling the length of the game. To then have to halt all your progress to catch this little arsehole will probably genuinely piss you off.
Hooey! Over here!
Didn't help that this was then followed by one of the more annoying boss fights in the game too, that highlighted the other major issue I think Lords of Shadow has, and that is its overabundance of quick time events. Remember those things? The button prompt sequences that were popularized by Resident Evil 4 and God of War, that then stayed around in the game industry for way too long. Yeah, Lords of Shadow uses these pretty heavily throughout for various interactions like mounting enemies, opening doors, and more specifically during every single boss fight. Usually the end of every boss is some kind of cutscene with a few Q2Es, which I recall actually being quite difficult on consoles due to a slight lag just before the scene transitions, something that you can still see in the remasters of Resident Evil 4. This isn't an issue on PC however, which is easily the best way to play the game now in my opinion. These QTE moments I found most bothersome during the Titan fights, which according to the art book were designed as homage to Shadow of the Colossus, with the director saying, "For every similarity there's 100 differences." I mean, that's a little hyperbolic. Sure, 3 Titans is a different number from 16 Colossi, and the Titans are mechanical entities as opposed to living creatures like the Colossi. That's 2 differences. For all intents and purposes, they function the same way as the Colossi, with battles broken up into 2 phases essentially. The first involves working out how to get on them. The second then has you climbing across them to find their glowing weak points to attack. Both incarnations don't like your character scaling and stabbing them understandably, and will attempt to shake you off. The annoying difference is that in Shadow of the Colossus, Wanda had a grip meter for how long he could hold on, and often you could let go at strategic points to regain your stamina, whereas Gabriel can hold on indefinitely until the Titan starts shaking, prompting a QTE and requires you to hold the button down until it stops shaking. This can be super irritating as failing this or letting go too soon results in Gabriel automatically falling back to the ground. With all that being said, these issues don't really tarnish the experience of the game severely in the long run. I mentioned this is a long game, right? When it all comes together, the combination of fantastic visuals, punchy combat and music, Lords of Shadow is one of the better God of War-like games out there from the time, and tells a suitably tragic tale that reinvents the Castlevania franchise in a really interesting way. So, from here on out, I have to issue a spoiler warning, as I'm about to start discussing the end of the game and the plot twists that follow, so either skip ahead or just stop watching, I guess.
I'm interested in this.
I think the first big spoiler to get out of the way is that the game doesn't actually end at the castle, like pretty much every other game in the series. At least it didn't before the DLC, but we'll get to that. Nope. You kill Carmella, the second Lord of Shadow, and then Gabriel carries on his journey, which then takes him to the land of the Necromancers. It's here that Zobek reveals himself to be none other than Death himself, and had in fact orchestrated the events of the game, starting with the death of Gabriel's wife Marie. Yeah, it does the God of War twist, where Gabriel restricts him to killing his wife himself, in this case under the influence of the Death Mask, as Zobek somehow knew he was the prophesized warrior who could destroy the Lords of Shadow, but hoped to betray him at the end to take all the power for himself. Just as it looks like you'll be fighting Death for the grand finale, Lucifer the fallen angel appears and seemingly kills Zobek, revealing him to be a dupe in his plan to return to heaven and have revenge on God.
It is my divine right to rule by his side, as an equal, or perhaps more than that.
You would rather rule in power and might than to offer forgiveness and love. This is why you are cast out, unholy one.
Gabriel, like the absolute badass he is, decides to take on Satan Isaacs, in what is actually a clever boss fight, and sends him back to hell. Damn, son. It's here that he tragically learns that the God Mask could never in fact raise the dead, merely see through God's eyes as the trapped souls finally depart to heaven, Marie along with them. And the credits roll. Anyone familiar with Castlevania at this point would probably thinking, that was really different. I guess Dracula just ain't a thing in this Castlevania, huh? I know that's exactly what I was thinking, and I was already dismissing the idea of any potential sequels. Until the credits ended and another cutscene started playing, as if this was some kind of Marvel movie. Zobek reappears, very much alive, in a decrepit old chapel where he encounters a shadowy figure and warns him about the imminent return of Satan Isaacs. This turns out to be none other than Gabriel, now a vampire and calling himself Dracula, or Dracul.
Gabriel. Don't you dare call me that. Saint Dracul.
Now in the present day, Gabriel is shown to be forlorn about his immortality, and Zobek offers to end it if he agrees to help him. This was the biggest twist of the lore in this reboot, establishing why the Belmonts ended up destined to fight Dracula, as they're all descendants of him and the bloodline of Gabriel are the only ones strong enough to face him. It was also heavily foreshadowed with references to Lament of Innocence for those who were paying attention. In Gabriel's bio, it mentions that he was found on the doorstep of the Brotherhood of Light, and was believed to be an abandoned bastard child of the Kronkvis family. In Lament of Innocence, Matthias Kronkovus conspires with Death to have Leon Belmont destroy the vampire Walter Bernhard, so he could become a vampire to spite God for the death of his wife, eventually naming himself Dracula. Furthermore, scrolls found in Carmilla's castle reveal that the castle originally belonged to the Bernhard family, and that she drove them out when she became a vampire. Pretty similar to what she does in the Netflix show, actually. But wait, those are cool references and all, but they don't explain how Gabriel became a vampire. Well, Mercury Steam decided to explore this narrative gap in the form of 2 DLC chapters named Revelry and Resurrection. Interestingly, Mercury Steam would later call these DLCs a mistake, and it's sort of understandable when you play them, as they're really a mixed bag in terms of quality. The first DLC sees Gabriel returning to the castle to help the vampire Laura, who reveals that Carmilla's death had broken a seal containing a cataclysmic entity known as the Forgotten One, another reference to the Lament of Innocence, that the Brotherhood are locked in another dimension, and this one ain't all bad. For starters, it's a welcome return to the castle, as the art design of it is still impressive to look at, particularly the 3rd level set in another exterior location. One of the things I noticed first was the platforming was a lot more difficult, and actually gave me some flashbacks to playing the original games, which might actually be a good thing to some people, I guess. This is also a very puzzle-heavy DLC, and I'm not gonna lie that a couple of them had me stumped for a bit. You're also required to play as Laura in mercifully brief sections, as her controls aren't as polished as Gabriel. The 3rd level is also super long too, like maybe one of the longest levels in the game, next to that Necromancer level. But overall, this is generally a decent time, ending with Gabriel killing Laura to become a vampire in order to enter the dimension of the Forgotten One, as only dark beings can survive there.
No, I do not want this.
The second DLC, Resurrection, however, is just bad, like really bad. It's essentially just the boss fight with the Forgotten One, who kind of looks like Steppenwolf, but not as stupidly over-designed, split over 2 levels. I imagine this was probably done because the idea of selling one level as a DLC maybe didn't sit well with them, but I mean, I see Assassin's Creed selling costumes individually, so I don't think it would have mattered. That still wouldn't have stopped this DLC from feeling just really rushed and unfun though. Both these levels start with platforming sections that are just really badly designed and highlight how finicky the jumping can be, especially when the camera isn't playing in your favour. The first fight against him isn't too bad, requiring you to deflect his magic attacks back at him to stun him, which triggers another QTE sequence where you break his armor, revealing weak points to attack. It even starts with a nice nod to Symphony of the Night.
Enough talk! How about you?
The second fight, however, I absolutely hated, as it required you to jump attack his weak point while simultaneously avoiding his massive area of effect attacks that I swear had broken hitboxes. I've seen people on YouTube cheese them easily, so I don't know, maybe I just needed to sleep on it and come back to it and I would have cheesed them too. But at the time I was so annoyed at this DLC that I was either going to finish it or uninstall it. Anyone else get that way with a game sometimes? At the end of all this, Castlevania Lords of Shadow ended up being quite a success for Konami and the franchise, becoming the most commercially successful game in the series, and was received pretty well critically too. It had a few flaws that kept it from being a truly amazing game worthy of the reverence like Symphony of the Night, but I do think that its achievements really do outweigh its minor shortcomings. It's probably considered blasphemy, but I actually think I've replayed this game and its sequel Mirror of Fate more than any other Castlevania game, at least in recent years I'd say. If you've never played this before and are thinking about it or wanting to replay it, thankfully doing so isn't too difficult. It's not available digitally on PlayStation 3, so you'd have to track down a copy online. However, it is available on the Xbox Store and works on Xbox One through backwards compatibility. The best bet though would have to be the PC version, which supports higher resolutions and includes both DLCs. Just make sure you play it with the gamepad, as this game really wasn't designed with a keyboard and mouse in mind. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this retrospective on one of my favourite action games from the 7th generation, and even just saying that makes me think of how crazy it is that it's been over 10 years since this game launched. If you did enjoy this, please consider subscribing, as I'm going to be doing videos on this game's 2 sequels, Mirror of Fate and Lords of Shadow 2. Stay safe and stay retro.